event, so please be aware of that. And then it will be available to view and listen to afterwards. We do have some contingency in place for load shedding today, so those of us who are facilitating should remain connected with you, but please let me apologize in advance in case we have any interruptions, but hopefully we can make the most of a fully charged event for most of us. Before I hand over to Melinda Swift from the GCRO to say a little bit more about today's topic on the economy, I'll just briefly introduce the two host organizations of today. So this series is jointly hosted by the GCRO, Gauteng City Region Observatory, and by the Mapungubwe Institute, or MISTRA. The GCRO is a partnership of the Gauteng Provincial Government, the University of Johannesburg, Wits University.
Heidi, you muted.
Thanks, Tamlin. I'm not sure how it muted me. Sorry about that. Yeah, introducing the GCRO. The GCRO's work supports cooperative government and builds the knowledge base of government, civil society, labour and communities, with a view to fostering an integrated, spatially coherent, economically competitive, innovative, environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive region. And Melinda will say a little bit more about the policy-facing research and analysis and evaluation that the GCRO produces. MISTRA, the other co-host of this event today, is an independent think tank that takes a long-term view on the strategic challenges facing South Africa, the continent and the globe. MISTRA was formed in 2010 and carries out research that addresses the country's various challenges, from nation formation, economic growth, and social equity to South Africa's global positioning. This is conducted through a process of engagement and facilitation, drawing on the wide range of expertise in the country and globally, and by using MISTRA's convening power to bring critical role players together. The GCRO and MISTRA have partnered to host this series of 3 webinars under the theme Rebuild South Africa. And these 3 dialogues are designed to respond to the recent turmoil that we faced in Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal in July of this year, but also to the devastating impact of COVID-19 on lives and livelihoods and our economy and democracy generally over the last year. South Africa was experiencing low economic growth before the pandemic, and this has worsened through 2020 and 2021. We continue to face the impact of state capture. And of course, all of this is set against the backdrop of ongoing challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So this series really tries to grapple with these challenges and looks to bring together a multiplicity of voices from government, business, academia, and civil society that we need to unpack what has happened, and to try and develop some solution-oriented insights and ideas that can help us as South Africa to rebuild. Our first event last month, for those of you who joined us, tried to sort of deepen our conversations around rebuilding communities, and today we look at rebuilding economies in particular. Our third and final event next month on the 24th of November will look at rebuilding government. So today's event, Rebuilding Economies, reflects particularly on the country's economic recovery and reconstruction plan, which was launched a year ago in Parliament. And we really want to reflect on what progress has been made to date, the impacts of the July unrest, and what we need to do to achieve a reasonable level of economic growth. Let me provide a quick overview of the programme for today, if Cameron wouldn't mind sharing it on the screen, just to give you a sense of how things will proceed. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Melinda Swift from the GCRO to do some brief inputs and opening remarks on the Rebuilding Economies theme. Then we'll move straight to our panel. So we have 4 panelists. First of all, Rudy Dix from the presidency, and I'll introduce all of our panelists in detail as and when they're about to begin. We also have Lebogang Malesi from COSATU, who's going to look at the ERRP, helping us to rebuild the economy. We have Nduduzi Mbada from the Gauteng Provincial Government on challenges of implementing the Growing Gauteng Together 2030 campaign. And lastly, we have Michael Sachs from Wits University on growth and fiscal crisis. Following that, we'll have plenty of time for rounds of discussion before we move back to our panel for some closing remarks. So you'll see that we've dedicated quite a lot of time to discussion and Q&A. So after the speakers have presented, we will have dedicated time for that. This is a very interactive event, so we welcome your inputs and we want it to be a conversation. So please, we just ask that you keep your inputs concise so that we can focus on and engage with them. But also please, throughout the event, do use the chat box. The team and I will monitor that and we'll bring those questions into the discussion as well. Also, if you wish to direct your question to a particular panelist, then perhaps also alert us to that in the chat box so that we can help you to do so. Our program runs until 5 p.m, so we have quite a long time slot, but please do remain with us for that. This is the second in the series of events that we've held on rebuilding, and we had a fantastic engagement at our first session last month. So please do stay with us till 5 p.m. We plan to pull together the inputs from this series into what we're referring to as a provocation. So that will try and analyze the issues presented during the series by the various speakers, but also importantly to try and move us towards ideas for interventions themselves to assist in rebuilding. I'm going to hand over now to Melinda Swift from the GCRO to say a little bit more about building economies. Melinda is an organizational effectiveness development professional, and she's currently in the role of operations and partnerships manager at the GCRO. She has over 20 years experience in senior management in the public sector, with highlights working in the oceans economy, the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site, and prior to that in sustainable resource management and land rights. Her personal interests include collaborating to secure the rights and inclusion of all young people in every aspect of life, especially the LGBTQ community and homeless children. Melinda has an honours degree in development. Melinda, I'm going to hand over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all again. Let me just start off by telling you a bit about the GCRO. The GCRO is a partnership between the Gauteng Provincial Government, Wits University, University of Johannesburg, and SALGA, organised metros and local government in Gauteng. We focus on academic research that is also policy-facing and very much focused on the Gauteng city region, so urban research. We do our research under a number of themes, and all of these research outputs you will find on our website. And it's a full gamut of outputs, from incredible GIS analysis to detailed research reports and everything in between. We are particularly keen on working in partnership, and this is why doing this Rebuild series with the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection is one of our really important partnerships. Moving straight on to what we would like to share with you today as an introductory set of thoughts is the GCRO's flagship quality of life surveys, which are at the core of our work, with results from the 6th iteration of the survey launched last month. The GCRO focuses on a quality of life index as the measure of well-being, rather than just on national economic measures. Over 13,500 respondents in the Gauteng city region, and from each of the 529 wards in Gauteng, have shared data on multidimensional variables, and these are our findings. At this moment, I'd like to particularly acknowledge all the field workers, the respondents, of course, and the excellent researchers at GCRO and further afield who analyze this data and make sense of it for us. Economic factors contribute directly to well-being, and the quality of life index lets us see this, but also see other factors that matter. All these factors are deeply interrelated, making a multi-sectoral approach essential. And some content from the qual results demonstrate these points very well with an appropriately economic focus, all analyzed from the 214 questions asked to our respondents. GCRO research shows that the economic fallout of COVID and general economic conditions are leading to substantial hardships in households across Gauteng. Of course, this is no surprise to all of you in the room. These findings provide us with clues as to where our rebuild efforts should be concentrated. A full 11% of all adults in Gauteng lost a job since March 2020, while 4% were forced to permanently close a business. 19% took a cut in salary and working hours since March 2022. Importantly, of those who had lost a job or closed a business, 50% have been unable to find new work, and 7% have dropped entirely out of the labor market. However, interestingly, white respondents and those with higher levels of formal education were notably more likely to have found new jobs than Black African respondents, or those with lower levels of education. This provides a stark example of the differential ability of people to bounce back from shocks. We found that over half of households experience some level of food insecurity, with 18% experiencing severe food insecurity. There are, however, also indications of positive responses from both government and society as a whole. Almost 1/4 of households in Gauteng included an adult who received the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, the SRD, while 13% received food support. And along with that, levels of community trust have risen dramatically. In a context where the proportion of Gauteng's households living below the average poverty line has risen to 36%, that's up from 25% in the 2017-18 year, which was the last time a quality of life survey was run. So how have vulnerable households been able to survive? Here, the role of the state is crucial, not only in continuing to provide the infrastructure and services that make urban life possible, but also through safety nets to help households meet their needs in the absence of sufficient work. In total, almost half of Gauteng respondents, that's 48%, said that someone in their household received a social grant of some kind. This was up from 42% in the 2017-18 survey. In May 2020, the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant was introduced for people who were unemployed. Almost a quarter, 23% of survey respondents indicated that someone in their household was receiving this 350 Rand grant. While grants are no doubt essential to those who receive them, we should note that 350 Rand is 1/10 of the minimum wage, and as such is not a replacement for decently paid employment. Other variables also illustrate the variations in ability to cope, with some households and individuals more vulnerable than others. So for example, the percentage of low-income respondents who recently missed a debt repayment went up, while the percentage of high-income earners who missed a debt repayment decreased. The impact of children being kept out of school is compounded in many of these households by limited access to home internet and computers. 3 out of every 5 households with children under the age of 18 do not have a working computer. And 4 out of every 5 of these households do not have home internet connection. So looking at this bigger picture and using a screening tool for depression, our data shows that 14% of Gauteng's residents are at high risk of depression. This is an increase from the previous survey. Those who experience at least one of the 5 economic impacts on the slide are far more likely than the average to be at high risk of depression. I mean, I guess it stands to reason. Mental health services must be prioritizing Gauteng's recovery, although the overburdened public healthcare system is struggling to cope with the pandemic, and even basic healthcare needs are going unmet. We know that Gauteng has long struggled with high levels of income equality, and this is still clearly evident in our Quality of Life 2020-2021 results. In light of the content we've shared, it is unsurprising that we've seen a notable decrease in the overall quality of life of all Gautengers. But targeted efforts to support the recovery needs of Black African women in particular are crucial. The Quality of Life Index provides a single score out of 100 that can be used to understand multidimensional well-being of respondents. Our quality of life index provides a measure of multidimensional well-being, drawing on 33 variables grouped into these 7 dimensions you can see on the screen. The mean quality of life index score for Gauteng has fallen from 64 in the 2017-18 year to 61. Just these few points actually show a marked decrease. And this is a return to the 2013-14 levels and reverses the gradual upward trend in index scores over time. There are also notable geographic variations in average quality of life across Gauteng's 9 municipalities, something that is very much top of mind at the moment. Every municipality in the province experienced a drop in qual index scores relative to the 2017-18 survey. And then, of course, link this to Stats SA findings on municipal dependency on national government funding, which is at an average of 30%. Of course, the finer details tell an even more difficult to understand story. Municipal performance clearly requires critical intervention. Looking at the scores for the 7 dimensions making up the index, we can see a particular drop in government satisfaction. Drivers of government satisfaction are complex and multifaceted, but our data suggests that restoration of trust and confidence in government through tackling corruption will be key, as is enhancing opportunities for socioeconomic recovery. In overall terms, as with socioeconomic circumstances, we also find evidence of stress and strain when looking at social fabric. Although there have been some positive findings too, which suggest greater social cohesion. Much of this was discussed in our last webinar, so I won't repeat it here. The GCRO quality of life and notions of well-being consider economic rebuilding as a holistic program, a holistic project, and managing all these variables, including our mental health, will be important to rebuilding. Much can also be said about climate change, the green economy, and of course, power issues. GCRO and MISTRA will produce a joint provocation, as Heidi mentioned earlier, from all 3 webinars in this Rebuild series, with the intention of bringing all these discussions into the public domain and discourse. We have confidence in the array of speakers and participants in this webinar and look forward to your thinking and on how to rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melinda. I'm going to move straight on, and we can come back to the issues that Melinda's raised in her section later in the discussion. I'm going to move straight on to the first of our panel members, which is Rudy Dix. Rudy is head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President. He's responsible for supporting the implementation of the Presidential Employment Stimulus, the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, as well as unblocking regulatory challenges that impact on employment and economic growth. He jointly leads Operation Vulindlela, which has been established as a joint initiative between the Presidency and National Treasury to accelerate structural reforms. And in his previous role, he was an outcomes facilitator at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, responsible for monitoring the performance of economic and infrastructure outcomes and supporting various economic interventions across government. In this role, he established the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment System and was responsible for its rollout across national government. He also formerly served as the Executive Director of the National Labour and Economic Development Institute, NALEDI, the research arm of CASATU from 2008 to 2013, and before 2008, he worked at CASATU and its affiliates in various capacities. Rudy studied at Wits Business School and completed the Management Advanced Programme and has a postgraduate diploma in economic principles, as well as an MSc in finance from the University of London. Welcome, Rudy. Thanks so much for giving your time to us today. I'll hand over to you and you have 10 minutes. Sure,
Heidi, I didn't know you were going to do the whole CV, but anyway. I've got 10 minutes, right? So I didn't prepare any slides and I thought it would be useful to, have a decent conversation. But in hindsight, I thought perhaps it would be useful to take, the participants back to where we started. So if you just allow me quickly, 3 slides, right? Is it showing up?
It is, yes, we can see them.
Wonderful. So I thought this is important that, the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, or ERRP as it's known, was an important intervention. And as you recall, it was a response to COVID-19 and the significant loss in growth, employment, and investment as a result of the shutdown that we had to implement to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But I thought that it's quite important that we contextualize the ERRP in a way, and I think the president made it fairly clear that what you want is not to go back to what you had before, but what it does do is to not only build what you had before, but also reconstruct and transform the economy in a manner that I think gives us an ability to reset. And I think this is important. So it's not just about pro-growth policies to achieve a particular socioeconomic transformation, but it's also about how we develop inclusivity and how we build the new economy. So what were the key principles? And I thought just reminding, because there's a lot of things that happened in the year. So it's a year since the announcement of the economic reconstruction and a plan. We had a lot of developments over the past 18 months, including a July attempted insurrection, lots of violence. And of course, we tend to forget what we set out to do. So I thought it's just important that we point out. First was to protect vulnerable workers, households, and firms, and develop a number of interventions around that, enhancing the capacity of the economy to grow and decisively disrupt the cycle of unemployment and underemployment. That was quite critical because you saw it as an opportunity to massify or scale up employment. Environmental sustainability as a pillar and an important area of growth, innovation, research, and development, developing a capable state and the capability across different functions that are going to be important for the implementation of the ERRP was important. But more so, we felt that the development of partnerships with the public sector, with the private sector, was going to be a pivotal and critical area where we're able to enhance and learn from the private sector in many of this. And of course, this evolved in a manner that I think helped us quite significantly. So if one looks at the Solidarity Fund, some of the other interventions where we were working with the private sector on a number of other areas, the banks, etc., on some of the interventions. And then, of course, intensifying local production and procurement and industrialization to create value and build forward and backward linkages in the economy. So I think it's quite important to do that. Now, in the context of the significant decline in economic activity, this was important as part of a stimulus effect to support households and firms, but also as a process of rebuilding the South African economy. And if you go to the next set of slides, what was contained in this elements of the, what were the 4 elements of the ERRP? The first was 5 priority interventions, and we'll talk slightly through some of them. I'm not going to speak to all of them. I thought perhaps it would be important to highlight and say where we're at in some of the key ones. There are 5 of those priority interventions. The second area was enabling conditions, and this was through Operation Vulindlela, the structural reforms, the process that we are partnering with the National Treasury in driving those structural reforms. Thirdly was creating a stable macroeconomic framework, and that was going to be quite important, particularly in the light of the kind of stimulus that you needed to boost the economy or to reignite the economy. So, making sure that we have resources available, but, don't lead to a fiscal cliff where we, unable to continue supporting the expenditure programs of government, but enough so that we're able to support the kind of challenges that we had as a result of the lockdown. And then, of course, institutional arrangements and capacity that the president regularly speaks about. So just the last slide is that, and I want to speak to each and every one of this, focusing a little bit more on the priorities and where we're at with each and every one of them. So where we're at, what we did say was that infrastructure investment would be the key pillar of driving that. Now, of course, one of the challenges with infrastructure investment is that it has long lead times. But what has happened is that through the Infrastructure Investment Office, the head of the office, Dr. Hosianso Ramagopa, has been able to, with a number of different departments and with the DPWI, to develop a pipeline of projects that are at a point of being shovel ready. And I think this has been critical to be able to get that through. I think one would have to admit up front that many of the kind of investments that were announced have not been able to, sod turn, but have been able to develop a process to ensure that these investments are able to be derived as quickly as possible. Infrastructure and the ability of the state to drive infrastructure is important, because when one talks about expenditure, this is where we think a priority of expenditure needs to go. It needs to go into the infrastructure program because it is, of course, catalytic and has a significant multiplier effect to be able to support a number of interventions, including, reinvigorating the private sector investment. Infrastructure, of course, from a network industry perspective is quite critical, partly because, if we're looking at getting our goods to markets, investments in rail or ports are going to be quite critical. And you've seen some of those things come through in the plans. What we've been very successful on is pillar number 2, which is the mass employment. And we've been able to pull together this plan across government in developing an intervention which we refer to as the presidential employment stimulus. And this has been quite critical, Heidi, in creating short-term employment for for a number of areas. The 3 focus areas that we looked at was, firstly, to save jobs, and that was quite critical because we were able to invest in saving 10,000 jobs that were affected in the global business services. In actual fact, the DTIC, through the presidential employment stimulus, was able to get the sector going again. The second component was livelihood support. And this was an innovative way because it wasn't a traditional public employment program, but we were able to support, for example, ECD practitioners, develop a voucher system, inputs into subsistence farmers to support them in different value chains across the agricultural sector. More than 50,000 small-scale agricultural subsistence farmers have been supported. This was an important area. There were also some other interventions, for example, in the creative sector, where we were able to support, workers and creative sector workers in both the National Arts Council, members of the National Arts Council, and those in the film and video sector. And this was an important because partly they were largely affected since they had to shut down. But more importantly, the most critical component of the public employment intervention was the employment component. And with that, we were able to launch one of the largest public employment programs, which is the program in the Department of Basic Education, where we had over 320,000 young people participating at all 22,000 schools across the length and breadth of the country, been paid minimum wages participating in this particular program for 6 months. This was very significant. There's a continuation of the program as it is right now. Many colleagues know that. We were able to pay them at 3,500, and the multiplier effect and the impact that has, for example, has been quite significant. The mass employment program is moving into its second phase. We're looking at institutionalizing it. There are a lot of other creative interventions that we've developed in phase 2. There's large components of funding that have gone. So if one looks at phase 1, for instance, 12.6 billion rand was paid into the employment stimulus program, slightly less in this phase, about 11 billion. There are ongoing negotiations and conversations, of course, through the MTech process to support the program going forward and to support the programs where they've been successful. Localization and African integration, again, quickly on this one, there's been quite a number of interventions around this. Just recently now, we've been looking at progress around finalizing many of the master plans, and where those master plans have been completed, looking at implementation plans. The importance of the master plan process, not only is it about the development of a plan and the implementation, but it's the ownership and the co-creation that is quite critical. And so, of course, what has happened is that master plans are co-created between government, business, and labor, and ensuring that everybody buys into this. Steel master plan, the automotive master plan, poultry, sugar, forestry, renewables, quite a lot of them have advanced quite far in the finalization of the plans, but including the implementation of that. What the DTIC and the IDC has done quite significantly so is to try and support and continue to support local manufacturing and the interventions around localization, including some of the interventions around some degree of import substitution for impact. Now, I know there's a lot of critique around this, but I think what is quite critical is that we need to promote local manufacturing that is competitive, that is able to compete with global players around many of the products that we do support. More recently, for example, the designation of cement.
Rudy, you've had 10 minutes, so maybe can you begin to sort of wrap up another 2 or 3 minutes? Thank you.
No problem. I'll wrap up right now. And of course, there are a lot of other interventions in the energy and security space and the green economy. I wanted to come to one area because I'm not going to focus on the macroeconomic framework. I think that's an area that we can continue to engage on. The institutional arrangement and capacity is important. But the other success is that we were able to get quite a significant momentum around the Operation Vulindlela and the structural reforms. And we identified reforms both in the energy sector, in the rail and port sector, in the water sector, in the telecommunications sector, for example, and also around the visa regime. And we've been able to make quite a significant progress. The biggest success, of course, is the ability for us to get the reform across around the embedded generation and unlocking the ability of the private sector without having to apply for a license, but simply to register to produce 100 megawatts of power through, of course, most of it will be renewable, and selling it out to one or many customers. Now, unlocking that cap was quite significant in trying to reduce the risk that we have of load shedding. Of course, as we know, again, this is 12 to 18 months lead time. We hopefully see this during the course of next year, where many of the key players in the mining sector, big industrial users, are able to utilize this particular mechanism. Again, another one is the corporatization of the National Ports Authority, the Transit National Ports Authority. This was a critical step in the process of breaking off TNPA, so that we ensure much more effective competition, investments into infrastructure that is required. There's a lot of ongoing conversations, of course, in trying to resolve the spectrum auctioning and, of course, the digital migration process. Some issues that we're dealing with in the water sector around water licensing and agency visa regimes. There's a process underway with Mavuso around improving the critical skills list and getting visas for skilled immigrants. Again, also another area where we're working with is around rail and concessioning of third-party lines for those who want to move from road. A lot of industry players are saying they want to move from road into that. Again, I thought that would be important to contextualize some of the areas that we think we've made quite a bit of significant progress on. There are lots of challenges, and we have to admit that upfront. But I think that's important for us to engage and how we improve that. Again, I think Heidi, the most critical point for us is that this has to be developed in concerted effort with the private sector, with unions, so we're able to see the kind of ERRP that we set out in achieving much of the interventions that we set out when the president had announced the ERRP in October. Thank you.
Rudy, will you stop sharing? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rudy. That carried on wonderfully from Melinda's summary of some of the socioeconomic issues facing Gauteng in particular, but you've really added a lot of detail there to various interventions that are helping to address some of the challenges that she highlighted earlier. Thanks so much. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker. I can see there's a few questions already in the chat, which is fantastic. We'll collate all of those and address them in the discussion just now. But next I want to introduce Lebogang Malesi from COSATU, who's going to speak to us about whether the ERRP is helping us to rebuild the economy. Lebogang works as a labour market policy coordinator for the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Her responsibilities and duties include the coordination and implementation of COSATU's labour market policy, and the just transition to a low carbon economy. Lebogang is an EXCO and MANCO member at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, and represents organised labour in the Labour Market Chamber of NEDLAC. She's a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Commission, as well as a commissioner on the Commission for Employment Equity. Thanks so much, Lebogang. I'll hand over to you. You also have 10 minutes.
Okay, I see I'm unable to start my video, so I think I'm just going to proceed without it. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to this event in order to talk about whether we think, sorry if I could, whether we think that the ERRP plan is making the necessary strides in order to rebuild the economy. My apologies, I'm going to proceed without the video. The electricity was meant to be back, but I see we're still suffering from load shedding, so we'll just take it from there. So thank you for the invitation, and I think I'll just, 10 minutes is a short amount of time, but I'll try to quickly whiz through it, whether we think that the ERP has been successful in building the economy. So in order to have some sort of reflections, I guess we'd have to consult Stats SA and have a look at the real GDP numbers and kind of have an indication as to where we are when it comes to GDP and GDP performance. I would have loved to do a quality of life sort of assessment. I think that's a more comprehensive way of looking at economic performance as compared to real GDP. But it's fine for now. We'll just rely on real GDP numbers. I mean, so if we look at the first quarter of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, and when we had the most harsh of lockdown measures at level 5, there was a drastic decline in real GDP numbers. And what we've seen from the Statistician General's report is that from quarter 2 in 2020 to quarter 2 of 2021, there has been significant recovery and rebuilding of the economy, if this trajectory is anything to go by it. So what we see here is that, you know, significant amount of progress and increase in real GDP numbers have taken us to where we currently sit with the quarter two 2021 numbers. The last time we sat at this level is quarter 4 of 2017. But just looking at this graph, I mean, I'm optimistic at heart. So it looks like we're well on our way towards some level of recovery if real GDP numbers are anything to go by it. But if you juxtapose that, I mean, with the presentation around quality of life, I think it tells a very telling story, and it zooms into the individuals who've been hardest hit when it comes to this pandemic. But when we look at real GDP numbers, I think it shows that, you know, we're going towards some level of a recovery. As to what proportion of this recovery is as a result of the ERRP plan, I mean, that's a subject of studies and looking at to what extent the correlation is actual causality. But I think what Rudy says in his presentation is quite key. I think the ERRP has been significant, especially when it comes to kickstarting the economy. I think when social partners and when government came together in NEDLAC to sit down and craft this ERRP, you know, the economy was probably performing at its lowest. So I think, to be quite honest, the short-term measures of the ERRP plan, we could say, have assisted the economy to recover, considering where we were at the harshest level of the lockdown. So Rudy has taken us through a number of short-term interventions that have been key. I think he's quite right, especially when he talks about the mass employment interventions. So that's support for small-scale farmers, the creation of new opportunities in labor-intensive municipal infrastructure maintenance, the creation of new opportunities for rural road maintenance, as well as the new opportunities for community health workers, as well as the public employment programs. Some of these, to name but a few, have been assisting the economy to recover to some extent. I think if you had to do a broader assessment of the ERP plan, the short-term interventions were a good kickstart mechanism to get the economy back onto a trajectory of growth. But where I think lies the greatest potential of significant and sufficient growth is in the medium to long-term interventions. And I think those are really key. When you look at, the interventions around energy and energy security, around achieving operational and financial stability of ESCOM, as set out in the social compact, those are quite key, and those become the engine that delivers the growth that we want to see in the economy. We're sitting here and some of us don't have electricity, and we know how chaotic that is. So the financial stability and the operationalization of ESCOM is actually key, and it's no wonder that there's such an increased urgency around dealing with the constraints that ESCOM currently faces, because without it, we can't turn the industrial wheel of the economy. I think another issue that's really key, and Rudy, you've also touched on this quite a bit, is really around this issue of the sectoral master plans. And Rudy's talked about a number of them. I think another one that's quite key, and I think we should really resume our attention on this, because this has the biggest growth potential, is around the renewable energy master plan. I think the renewable energy sector is going to be a game changer for South Africa. I think this is the biggest opportunity ever since the introduction of the telecommunications industry. So these are going to be significant drivers of growth, as well as employment, and it should help us when it comes to alleviating poverty. One of the other things, and I think this is what's going to be really important, and Rudy, again, you've touched on this, is around this issue of localization and local manufacturing. I think what the pandemic taught us is that, being an economy that's significantly reliant on imports is not necessarily sustainable. So we need to build our capacity to be able to increase local manufacturing, as well as local procurement and localization. I think that's going to be quite key, especially if we're wanting to move the economy towards a trajectory of growth. Maybe just to expand on this, just to take you through a brief sort of diagram that shows, the various structural changes that various economies have gone through. So, for example, an economy will start off, or any country will start off with a high agrarian economy, agricultural sector, and then move towards manufacturing as you develop your manufacturing capacity. So labor and economic impact. And you've grown manufacturing significantly, you would then move on to the service sector. So this process of structural transformation or structural change is actually quite key, especially in the South African context. What you'll have is the more developed nations would have followed this particular trajectory. The Asian giants, to a certain extent, have also followed this particular trajectory. But we have a funny thing going on in South Africa, and in fact, this is the case in most of sub-Saharan Africa as well, is that you'll have economies that do depend on the agricultural sector. So they've got this agrarian economy, and then there will be some sort of manufacturing, but what you'll see over the years and post the 1980s is that manufacturing will then drop, and it drops prematurely without the sector having been significantly developed. And now what's happening is that now we're moving on to the service sector. But the problem is you don't necessarily benefit from any development, and manufacturing doesn't necessarily result in any significant growth because it's not adequately developed as yet. So you have a premature move from agriculture manufacturing to service without actually having not strengthened your manufacturing sector quite significantly. So what manufacturing actually is, the proposals around or the interventions around manufacturing and the manufacturing sector and localization are actually very important because for an economy to grow quite significantly, it's dependent on how strong the backbone of that economy is. And the backbone of the economy is usually the manufacturing sector. So before we can even move into, well, we've already moved into the service sector, what we really need to do is bolster manufacturing. And I think the interventions around localization, local procurement are quite key in order to strengthen this particular backbone and the manufacturing and industrial sector of the economy. I've talked about this. The key here is in the reconstruction of the economy. We can recover, and there are quick things, low-hanging fruits that you could take and things that you can do quickly in order to kickstart the economy, which is great. But what you do want to do, especially in South Africa with such high levels of inequality, you want to ensure that you don't miss out on the opportunity to reconstruct this economy in order to deal with the high and unsustainable levels of inequality. Inequality is the structural problem in this country. So what you want to be key in this whole process of
Labran, can you wrap up in the next minute or two, please?
So if we don't do this, this could be a serious missed opportunity. And I think there's various ways in which we can go about ensuring that we include this important element of reconstruction. And this can be done through redistributive fiscal policy, industrial development, but most importantly is around this issue around collective and public ownership and public forms of ownership, which I think needs to find expression much more deeply and in its implementation in the ERRP. I know the aspiration is there for collective and public forms of ownership, but what you find that it somehow lacks in the implementation. So really what we need is to look for cooperatives, and we need to support them closely and link them to state initiatives in order to build a progressive alliance between collective forms of ownership in the economy. These, we believe, would lead to the redistribution of power in the economy, and that will really break the back of strongholds that only a few conglomerates hold in the economy currently. Chair, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, Labran. Before I introduce our next panelist, I just want to acknowledge a couple of people who I can see have joined us. And want to just give them an extra welcome. So I can see Sheila Sisulu is here, public intellectual and activist. You're very welcome. Professor Ruth Hall, who works in land and agrarian issues. Neil Coleman from the Institute for Economic Justice, and also Fouad Qasim, who is a former advisor in the Ministry of Finance. Thank you very much for joining us. We've just noticed that you've joined us. I'm going to go back to the panel, and following on now from Lebachang is Nduduzi Goodwill-Mbada from the Gauteng Provincial Government, who's going to speak to us on challenges of implementation of the Growing Gauteng Together 2030 initiative. Nduduzi is head of the policy unit in the Gauteng government, Office of the Premier. He's a seasoned, skilled practitioner in strategy development and planning, policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. He's a board member of the GCRO And in 1999, he was appointed ANC Gauteng Policy Coordinator, responsible for monitoring, evaluation, and implementation of policy. Between 2004 and 2007, he served as the secretary of the ANC caucus in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, where he dealt extensively with issues at the nexus of public policy and lawmaking. He went on to provide strategic advice and support to the premiers of Gauteng and the Minister of Arts and Culture on policy and governance matters from 2008 to 2019. And he holds a Master's of Management from the Wits University and is registered with Wits to pursue a research project on inclusive cities. He led the team that organized the hosting of the inaugural Africa Investment Forum in partnership with the African Development Bank in 2018. And between 2014 and 2018, he served as a member of the Wits University Council. He served as a member of the Project Management Office that provides strategic support on the Gauteng City response to the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically leading the data research and analytics team, working with the Premier's Advisory Committee on COVID-19 to ensure evidence-based decision-making by the Gauteng City Region Provincial Coronavirus Command Council. Thanks very much. And does he also have 10 minutes? I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Tamlin. I'll do my best to stick to the 10 minutes. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity. Let me just say that in response to the global and the domestic challenges that confronted us prior to 2009, where the economy growth was subdued, unemployment inextricably high, poverty worsening, we adopted a plan called the Growing Gauteng Together, which was basically our contribution to the National Development Plan, but more importantly, taking forward the implementation of the work that we had already started that was aimed at transforming, modernizing, and reindustrializing the Gauteng economy, primarily because of the problems of deindustrialization that was already happening in some big parts of the Gauteng city region. Of course, we worked with a number of critical researchers, and by just looking at the in-calamity scenarios, Spujwa, Kwarakwara, Nile Walk, the intention was to then say, what kind of a province do we want to build, and what kind of a South Africa do we want to build, and therefore what should be the contribution of this large economy into the economy of South Africa. And we really position ourselves into the scenario of Nile Walk, and also because the scenario of the Nile Walk vision was part of the simulation, integrated scenario that produced about 6 pillars that were looking at the national, provincial, and policy roadmap for the realization of the Nile Walk economic development vision. We pulled in what came also from the national policies, but also bring in the municipalities' plans, because we believe that we have to operate as one in a context of a city region, so that whatever interventions we're making have got to be taken into that, take that into consideration, that we're responding to the one space or one people, irrespective of the boundaries or whomever is responsible for this or that city in the city region. Precisely why we're working very closely with the Gauteng City Region Observatory that also helps us on issues of evidence and so forth and so on. But of course, you'll all agree that there would have been challenges that we came across that have affected the country and many of us. For us, COVID-19 was the biggest challenge. The second one, the social unrest that many of the colleagues have spoken to. But we think there's an important challenge that we need to talk to, which is the policy levers that necessarily some of the provinces, or like us as the biggest city region, we do not have certain policy levers and unable to make certain interventions. And those really relate to macro policy reforms, which I'll just speak to at the end. Of course, we will all appreciate that as we're beginning to implement the plan, the COVID-19 situation came. I will not spend a lot of time on this, because I think what Melinda demonstrated was really the impact of COVID-19 on the Gauteng City region in as far as the impact it had. Secondly, the social unrest would have really devastated and impacted on a very important area of our work, particularly the townships, because we have been investing a lot since the fifth administration on what we call the township economy revitalization plan or strategy, so that we can create townships from what we always know them for, being bedroom communities, to become centers of economic production, by making sure that we invest in their productive capacity. And that's why you will see, for example, like issues of the Gautrain and extension into the township, because we believe that we must invest where people are at. So that would also be the biggest challenge that we have. I would just like to indicate that we thought one of the third challenges for us has always been the issue of fiscal and monetary policy, something that I think Rudy touched on. And we think that it is important to move with speed in some of those reforms in order for us to support and achieve industrial transformation and inclusive economic growth. This also relates to the fact that one of the things we're doing in the Gauteng City region is investing in what we call building Gauteng as a multi-tier special economic zone. Also because we believe investing in the SEZ is also part and parcel of our industrialization and reindustrialization agenda. But you would find that we are unable to make certain interventions because we need to work very closely with national government. Where we're working with national government, there's quite a lot of significant improvement. Where we're working with the private sector, including with municipalities, you will see the Tshwane Special Economic Zone is one critical example that when the national government, provincial government, and local and the private sector work together in line with our 6-pillar strategy, you can see significant results in relation to the necessary changes that we need to make in the economy. As I said, we did remodel our plan in response to the COVID-19 and the social unrest. The remodeled GGT 2020 brought in the possibility of the expansion of the tourism sector, the growth in trade, catering and accommodation sectors, growth in exports of for the agricultural sector, a rise in labor productivity, and increased competitiveness of strategic sectors. The issue of agriculture, while Gauteng is always considered an urban province, there are quite a lot of investment that particularly as far as agro-processing is concerned. And that's why one of the interventions we're making is to build the western part of the Gauteng City region into an agro-SEZ, and we're working very well with the national government and the private sector in that regard. We thought it's important to indicate that we had done this modeling and looked as to where are we in terms of our planning, monitoring and evaluation of our plan in as far as tracking progress towards the 9-year walk, and looked at 4 critical areas that I'll just demonstrate the results to date because of the importance of this modeling exercise, as opposed to general statements that this is what we'll do, but rather invested in a tool that assists us to say quantify the impact of our interventions against the desired outcomes, but also assess the impact of national policy, national and economic policy measures on the province. Why we want to do that is because when we engage and work with presidency, national treasury, DPME, we need to demonstrate that if national can do the following things, these are the results. If the cities, the private sector comes on board, invest into the economy of Gauteng, these are the results. So that's the important part that we thought it's important to move in adopting this kind of a plan. Of course, I would just want to go straight to indicating that the model estimates that the Gauteng economy will expand by 5.3% in 2021, rebounding from the market contraction of 8% in 2020. An economy stabilizes from the shock of COVID-19, probably something that the earlier colleagues, particularly Lebkhang, has also demonstrated that the Gauteng GDP is modeled to increase by 2.3% in 2024. Over the medium term, the economy is expected to expand by the average annual rate of 3.6%. It is important that over the medium term, the economy is expected to expand by an average annual rate of 3.6, notwithstanding the medium-term forecast come in short of the 6.8% average growth target of the 9-year work targets of the provincial economy is expected, therefore, to improve steadily over the medium term. I think it's important to just indicate that we took this decision of the 9-year work scenario and the 9-year work targets primarily because we have to be ambitious, and where there's a need to revise our targets, we'll do so. But I think it's important to always set yourself an ambitious vision and then work towards that kind of a vision. Of course, as I indicated, that we look at the model also looks at the contribution of our municipalities, and we therefore say that the result is that at municipal level, economic performance is expected to improve steadily over the medium term, increasing by between 2.1 and 4.2 percentage points over the different regions. The significance of looking at the performance of municipalities is also because of the certain policy levers that especially our metros have, and therefore working with our metros, we are likely to make certain qualitative changes into the economy, including issues of the borrowing capacity, a green bond, and so forth and so on. So it is important to track the performance of our municipalities. Of course, with regards to unemployment rate, there is a steady decline in unemployment rate from the base of 35.9% in 2030, and unemployment rate in Gauteng is expected to decline to 34.1% in 2021. So far, relative to the 9-year work average growth rate of 31%, the Gauteng unemployment rate is modeled to be only 1.5% points higher. Just because of time, allow me to just go to the third aspect of the outcome of our model, that we were hoping that the poverty rate in Gauteng to moderate to 29.9% in 2021 from 31% in 2030. It's important to indicate that relative to the targets, the poverty rate is expected to be recorded at a much elevated level by 2024. Of course, with regards to the steady decline in inequality by measuring Gini coefficient in terms of the Gini index, we're expected to increase to 71.6% in 2021 from 70.2% in 2020. In the medium term, the Gini index is expected to measure at 8.3 percentage points higher than the 9-year work target. The full implementation of the remodeled GGT will lead to the Gauteng economy towards an improved measures of the 4 key development indicators. However, we know that the M&E framework model that indicates that the projected improvements will fall short of the 9-year work medium-term targets. And that's why we are saying there are specific things in line with the economic recovery plan and in line with our growing Gauteng Together plan. There are specific things that we want to do, including working with national and working with the private sector. First, we want to continue to create enabling conditions for infrastructure rollout as catalyst for district development. The reindustrialization.
Can I ask you to start wrapping up? Sorry, can I ask you to start wrapping up? Thank you. Thanks.
Beautiful. No, beautiful. This is my last slide. So we want to also bring opportunity to the main and confront inequality at the spatial level through the township economy revitalization plan, a point that I made earlier. A big focus on issues of youth, working with national focus on issues of mass public employment, but also the restructuring of Gauteng economy for long-term growth for us remains critical in the context of modernizing the network industries. We also want to engage the private sector, social partners, something that we're already doing because our GGT 2030 and the work that we think comes from the National Economic Recovery Plan will only be successful if we continue to invest in social compacting. Hence, the work we're doing with PPGI is positioned as organized business conduit for both the action labs and other sectors that are critical in growing the Gauteng economy. So we really hope that all the work that we've put in place so far will catapult us and really get the Gauteng economy back on track in line with the plan that we've put in place. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mduduzi. It's good to have the provincial picture following the national one from Lebogang and Rudy. I can see already in the chat people are sort of joining the dots together with the various presentations. So we have one more panelist before we move on to a discussion. So let me welcome Michael Sachs from Wits University. Michael works, teaches and researches on economics, public policy and politics in South Africa. He's a former head of National Treasury's Budget Office. And he spent 9 years at the national headquarters of the ANC, where he coordinated economic policy and led the party's research agenda. Professor Sachs has a master's degree in economics and international development from the University of London and Harvard's Kennedy School. He's currently leading the Public Economy Project, a research initiative that aims to build analytical capabilities on macro fiscal policy, public economics, and public financial management. This is located at Wits University's Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, a multi-partner research and policy project on understanding and addressing inequality in the Global South. He teaches public economics and fiscal policy at the School of Finance and Economics and at Wits School of Governance. He is the Deputy Chair of the Finance and Fiscal Commission, an independent commission established by the Constitution to provide impartial advice on matters of public finance and intergovernmental fiscal relations to Parliament, provincial legislatures and other authorities. And this is a part-time position appointed by the President. Thanks very much, Professor Sachs. Over to you. You also have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I want to reflect a little bit on the recovery and reconstruction program, but also maybe chip in a little bit to the debate that has been going on recently about growth and the fiscal path and debt stabilization, whether we have a growth or a debt problem. So if I hope you see my screen. If I was to put my kind of sense of where South Africa is on one slide, I think this is the metric I would use. It's not the quality of life, it's GDP per capita. And I always say GDP per capita doesn't, or GDP doesn't measure everything, but it does measure income, which is important for the quality of life. And you can see that South Africa had a increase in its GDP per capita in real terms. This is in real terms, in the first decade or so of democracy. But when the global crisis hit us in 2008, something very fundamental changed. And since then, we have been on a growth path. We've been in a condition of stagnation. So at first, the global crisis hit us and we lost GDP per capita. But then even as we recovered, and in the first initial years of the last recovery from that 2009 shock, elevated commodity prices played a very important role. So the Chinese growth was driving the boom in commodity prices, and that helped us recover very strongly from 2009. But as soon as commodity price improvements petered out, GDP per capita began to fall. And it has been falling. It reached a peak in 2012 or 13 or thereabouts. It's been falling since then. You can see the massive impact of the coronavirus shock, which implies a permanent fall in South African living standards. And then there's a recovery that we're debating now. But if this is the forecast from the IMF, and the expectation is that we will continue on this path of stagnation and declining economic growth. It's important to say one thing about GDP per capita is that as well as being income, it is it's the broadest measure of productivity. So it is telling us what is the output, the value of the output produced by each South African on average. And so when your so it's the broadest indicator that productivity in the economy is falling. And it's important to state in these days of very many important debates in macroeconomics, what growth is. What does growth mean? Growth means a social process of technological change capital accumulation, and structural change that go together. And these processes lead to a cumulative and sustained expansion in economic value. In other words, you could say income per person. And they, I don't know, somebody needs to mute themselves somewhere, but so this is what growth is. It is not spending money as some people would have us believe. So over this decade of stagnation, we were in a pretty good fiscal position at the beginning of this decade of stagnation. But over this decade of stagnation, we have now entered a period of fiscal crisis. And there are two indicators of this fiscal crisis here. The first, on the left-hand side, just shows the real interest rates that government pays on its debt, and it goes back to 1958. And this red line is the real interest rate, and you can see that we now have the highest real interest rate on our government debt that we have ever had. You know, it bumped about a little bit during the 2000s, mainly because inflation was running high. But in nominal terms, we are back where we were during the state of emergency in the late 1980s. That's the nominal level of interest rate that we have. But because inflation has fallen, another indicator of stagnation, our real interest rate is the highest ever. Another indicator of the fiscal crisis is that this graph on the right shows, the black line shows the real growth in core government spending. And what do I mean by core government spending? I mean spending excluding interest payments and excluding bailouts of state-owned companies. So the spending on services, goods and services provided by the public sector, as well as transfers to poor households. And you can see the period during the 2000s where spending was growing at a rate of about 10% in real terms, so 10% in excess of inflation for every year for about a decade between 2000 and 2012. But then as the administration changed and the Zuma administration took over, there was a sharp curtailment in the growth of expenditure. And it was brought down to this red line, which is the rate of population growth. And it was sustained at about this rate of population growth until the change in administration again, since when it has been increasing quite steadily in the growth. But the point I want to make as an indicator of fiscal crisis is that the reason the growth of spending has been curtailed is because this gray line, which is the growth of debt service costs that we have to pay out of taxation, shot up dramatically. And the reason it shoots up dramatically is because interest rates rise. It's because of the graph on the left-hand side. It's a combination of interest rates rising and growth declining. So many people are saying that fiscal policy is the answer to low growth. In fact, Mdu also was seeming to indicate so just now. But my starting point is that we are in fiscal crisis because growth is low. Fiscal policy is a symptom of the crisis we face, and therefore is not very effective as a solution. Nevertheless, Treasury is proposing a solution. And this graph is the same data, the same line, but I've just extended it forward a few years to include Treasury's projections from the last budget. And what they are projecting is that real growth in this expenditure will contract by around 3% each year for the next 3 years. So you can see immediately that if you compare that to the last attempt of fiscal consolidation, which was during the gear period in the 1990s, what is on the table now is far deeper and far more sustained over time. We're talking about a significant reduction in government spending, far in excess of what took place in under gear, and over an extended period of time. We've penciled in, or Treasury has penciled in, the next 3 years. That's their horizon. But everybody knows that the primary balance that will be achieved then is not sufficient to stabilize debt. And therefore, the program is to probably continue this contractionary stance for the next 3 to 5 years. That is what is on the table. So then the question becomes, does government have a program? to change this trajectory. And I've tried to put together what I think are the important elements of that would constitute this program. And I've divided them into three pieces. The first part, 1, 2, and 3, that's the economic, that's the official program, what we are told we are doing. Then we have a set of policies where there is some confusion, or it is not clear what it is that will be the final outcome. And then at the bottom, we have Treasuries Program. So at the top, we have Presidency Program. At the bottom, we have Treasuries Program, which is a fiscal consolidation, as I've showed you, extremely severe fiscal consolidation, which involves reducing the real incomes of teachers, nurses, and police officers sustained over a period of 5 years, and reducing employment in basic education, healthcare, and criminal justice quite significantly. So this is why I put presidential employment stimulus, why I put the stimulus in quote marks, because I think it is doublespeak. What the fiscal consolidation will do is significantly reduce employment in two senses. Firstly, because it's going to have a massive impact on aggregate demand, which is going to reduce employment across the economy. And secondly, because there is a direct plan to reduce the number of public employees, principally teachers, nurses, and police officers. And so effectively what the presidential employment stimulus amounts to is swapping decent, secure, and kind of middle-class professional work for low-income, precarious, and low-skill work within the public sector. I don't see how that will stimulate the growth of employment. As welfare programs, I think all of the things that are being talked about are very important, and hopefully we can sustain them. But as a macroeconomic intervention, it is quite insignificant in terms of the path of employment. Secondly, the program rests on public investment and a little bit of promotion of private investment through conferences and envoys and the like. The problem with relying on public investment is not the absence of technical skill or a pipeline or something like that. The problem is that these policies in the middle, these uncertain policies, especially 4, 5, and 6, the green transition, and the approach of government towards high-cost public network monopolies, which are raising costs across the economy, and I'm talking about Eskom and Transnet principally, is unclear. And, you know, if you want to break down what is public investment, it is essentially 4 things. It's Eskom, Transnet, the water utility sector, and roads. And
Michael,
there is no...
Can you begin to wrap up in a couple of minutes, please?
I will do so. This will be my last slide, I think. So there is no policy certainty. There's no clarity on the end state in any of those sectors, or how infrastructure will be funded. So for example, there's nothing stopping the building of roads, but government has abandoned e-tolls. And now that requires government to allocate resources out of general taxation in order to finance the building of roads, resources which are needed for all kinds of other things. Localization, finally, is probably an important thing to do, but it's kind of a hard stretch to believe that it is going to support growth and recovery in the medium term. So then we've got these ambiguous policies about the green transition. We don't know what's the plan really, whether we're going to accelerate the decommissioning of coal or not. We don't know what government stance is on the reform of high-cost network monopolies. And because they don't want to pass the costs of these monopolies on to the rest of society, the choice seems to be that we should finance them also out of general taxation, as is the case with Sanral and Eskom and maybe one day Transnet. We've then got a basic income support proposal that is likely to be agreed, and I think it will be agreed. And my point is not to argue against any one of these policies, but simply to say government doesn't have a program of recovery. It has a piece of paper called the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Program, but de facto, there's no clear path forward that will change the path of stagnation and decline that we have been on for the last decade. And therefore, I expect fiscal crisis to worsen, and fiscal crisis itself becomes a headwind to growth because it leads to very high interest rates that the monetary authorities can do very little about. It leads to capital flow instability, and it leads to a general sense of uncertainty about property rights and the future political direction of the country. So unless we become serious about resolving these contradictions, I expect the stagnation will continue over the medium term. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Michael. That was a very strong finish to our panel. And thank you to all the panelists. We've got a number of questions. I'm going to invite people to also raise their hands if they would like to, but we'll go through the questions in the chat. Just quickly, let me also acknowledge a couple more people. Professor Anthony Butler from Political Science at UCT, and also the author of one of Cyril Ramaphosa's biographies. Also, Dr. Tami Mozwai, who's a former news editor, but now provides intellectual leadership on small business development. Thank you for joining us. Martin Kingston from Business Unity South Africa is also here, and Tanya Cohen, the former CEO of Business Unity South Africa, who now works on the Presidential Progressive Growth Initiative. So Tanya, you may want to jump in and say something about that. Let me take a couple of questions from the chat, and then I'll go to Dr. Mozwai, who's, I can see your hand is up. There was a number of comments and questions on unemployment to Rudy and to Mduduzi. One saying that the type of jobs that you referred to, Rudy, such as the education assistance, the expanded public works program, won't lift people out of poverty and fail to develop the skills needed in the economy. And also that localization and value addition will require a developmental state. Would you describe South Africa as a developmental state? I see that Rudy's posted the employment stimulus booklet in the chat, I think as a response to a couple of employment queries. But Rudy and Duduzi, maybe you both want to say something more about unemployment figures and unemployment prospects, particularly in light of the quality of life findings around unemployment in the province. There's a couple of questions around the green economy and transition of ESCOM. So any thoughts from panelists on green financing ahead of COP26? And another on the importance of energy recovery as well. So reminding us about the solution to save energy. So very little in government and ESCOM plans to limit renewable generation. Buildings count for 40% of CO2 emitted. So this is key to having an action on insulation and energy savings policies. So there's a request for comments on that. Also from Ruth Hall at PLAS, University of the Western Cape, Professor Ruth Hall. You are also asking for some discussion on the agrarian economy as well. And I might ask you, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind sort of expanding on your question. So you've mentioned here, South Africa isn't following a European or North American economic transition, let alone an East Asian one. South African context is one of de-agrarianization and deindustrialization. So the linear path proposition doesn't seem to accurately capture our predicament. So Prof. Hall, maybe you want to add a little more to that. So there's a few questions there. Let me also just take one in this round from Dr. Tami Mozwai. I can see your hand is up, Dr. Mozwai.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brooks, and thanks very much for this opportunity in what is a very stimulating discussion. I would like to compliment the Gauteng government for really initiating the township economy revitalization strategy, because that is one of the most important interventions that we have had in terms of reversing the policy of apartheid. In the past, the townships were inextricably intertwined with the CBDs. What the Gauteng government is now doing It's now creating independent economies of the townships. The same situation as you'd have an independent Pretoria or Johannesburg economy. And the Gauteng government must really be lauded for that. Particularly, what now must be brought to fore is the new bill that on the township economy by the Gauteng government. And my contribution in this to see to what extent this can be made national, because we have a problem of a migration from other areas to Gauteng. Now, if at all Gauteng continues to be the smart province and the others are not catching up, then obviously that migration will continue, and we're going to have problems as we have had problems in the past. So I've got a couple of suggestions to make. One, I believe that the township economic revitalization strategy has got to be sector-driven, and we should look at those sectors in which there is a high participation by the locals, like the food and textiles. I am not excluding the other ones, but I'm saying that we need to strengthen the township, those township entrepreneurs. The current situation is that the township economy, according to a report that was issued this week by Biz News, is 61% owned by foreigners. Obviously, we cannot, allow this to continue, because it has in it the seeds of future social instability. That has got to be dealt with. Now, coming to the whole issue of sector-driven, I'm suggesting that perhaps we should look at one or two sectors, particularly the food sector, because the government spends over 30 billion rand in terms of food for hospitals and prisons. Now, if that money, that food, that amount, we get co-ops of Black women in the various districts to provide food for prisons and the hospitals, obviously the amount of activity that is going to be created will be phenomenal. And we know that the multiplier effect is going to kick in. And once the multiplier effect kicks in, there are going to be the service sector is going to grow in the township, in as much as the manufacturing sector, in many ways, will also start growing. We will also start growing in the township. The current situation, in which we just have a generalist approach to the townships, is very unfortunate. Just as much as the generalist approach that we have to small business development. There is no way that the FDI or the current initiatives are going to absorb 9 million people into the economy over the next 10 years. So it means that we must strengthen the small business sector in many ways. A few years ago, I don't know why this program was discontinued. The government had the NIBAS program, program in which it was strengthening and capacitating the informal businesses in various parts of the country. Now, one would argue that that program needs to be revitalized, strengthened, because you've got to, people investing in the small business that are existing is cheaper than in starting new businesses altogether. These people have paid their school fees, so why don't we strengthen them? And as we strengthen them, they will start absorbing. Other people as workers, because it's a status symbol for small businesses to have somebody who reports to you. What's big business will be cutting labor, but with small businesses, they are always, well, you can't say you are a owner of a business when you don't employ anybody. So these are the few points that I would like to perhaps bring in. And the last one, of course, is that I do not understand why the informal traders in Tshwane and in Johannesburg are being persecuted. Yes, they might be dating the towns, but there's a better way that can be found to make sure that they are educated in not too dirty towns. The figures that I'm going to give you are shocking. 30% of the informal sector have got turnovers of less than 20,000 rand per annum, not per month, 20,000 rand per annum, and that's 30%, which means that it's 1,500 rand turnover per month. Now, when you take the stock of that person, you are condemning him to being a beggar in the street when he was actually feeding himself. So I want to suggest that perhaps we need to review some of the small business approaches, strategies that we have, nationalize, make the township, the Gauteng TER strategy much more national. And that way we'll perhaps see a lot of difference on the ground than is currently the case. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Maswai. I'm going to take the remaining hands here, another 3 hands before we go back to the panelists to respond. Fuad Kasim, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry my camera is not working. I do apologize for that. Thank you for the presentations. I just wanted to say that, you know, I really agree strongly with Michael Sachs. And the situation that we face is one of secular stagnation. That is a long-term decline in the economy, and one of the key reasons as to why it's declining, and particularly at this point in time, is that while we're talking about all sorts of things like reforms or whatever, investment is decelerating. So we've got a contraction in investment to GDP. And one of the key reasons for that is that we've got a serious misalignment or disconnect between the public and the private sector. And I don't see a serious program to woo or to encourage the private sector to invest in the economy. Michael alluded to that by saying that there's policy uncertainty. Well, we have policy uncertainty, we have policy instability, and policy incoherence. So I think if we really want to get investment going, get growth going, and through that reduce debt in the economy, we have to reconstruct this relationship between the public and the private sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Let me go to Tanya Cohen.
Thanks very much. I'm also going to leave my camera off as my line's quite unstable. I'm with the Public-Private Growth Initiative, so it's PPGI. And we do quite a lot of intermediary work and facilitation in terms of unblocking sector-based challenges together with government. It used to mainly be in the national space, but more recently we've been working far more closely with Gauteng and some of the district development pilot districts. And I think there's a few observations. A lot of what we do is very practical unblocking. So one of the things that we do is we ask sectors what are their big constraints, and then we really hone in on what those big areas are, and try and unblock them by intermediating sometimes between the government department and the sector, depending on the nature of the constraints. I think one of the things that's come out very, very clearly is the point that Fuad's just made, is that on a sector basis, there are some serious policy challenges that have been quite sticky and which haven't been resolved. So particular sort of policies like the Upstream Petroleum Resources Bill in DMRE, or on the forestry side, there's legislation under DFFE that is preventing recapitalization and growing of state forest land. And the list could go on. But I think what we're starting to see is that the approach of the master plans that Rudy refers to is really starting to unlock that. And that for us, I think, is starting to show that things are being done a little bit differently. There certainly is a much higher level of listening to private sector in terms of what are the constraints, a much higher degree of sort of receptiveness, if I could say that, to understanding what are the levers to promote investment. And I think a greater level of urgency and prioritization. And that's not across all of them, but it's certainly starting to reflect in a number of the master plans. In the Gauteng space, we've been working with the province actually as a result of COVID on a number of public-private partnership projects to accelerate township economy. And that, Dr. Mazwai, speaks to exactly the points that you made. We managed to mobilize growing to market trials in terms of agricultural production, installation, repair and maintenance, where township SMMEs have been brought together and clustered to be able to repair public buildings such as hospitals, but also to participate in the construction industry value chain. Location of global business services, call centers into location environments. And I think that what we're starting to see is that there's really an appetite to partner. There's a huge amount of innovation and enterprise that is possible. And it's starting to really demonstrate models of developments that are far more community orientated and localized. And I think the same in some of the district development pilot work that we're doing. So I think, contrary to, and I hear the story that Michael gives in terms of like the sort of the fiscal situation that we're in, and also I think the growth situation that we're in. But I think what we're starting to see is some trends emerging that are more optimistic on the ground. And that really is a combination of greater receptiveness by government to private sector partnering. And that's not these big PPPs, but it's around partnering, around just mobilizing implementation and getting things going. There's definitely a greater level of focus and prioritization. Like I think we see in the Gauteng War Room now, a focus on 3 high growth sectors that can really deliver significant growth and jobs in the next 2 years. There's a willingness to partner, and I think a delivery orientation which has not been as evident before. And then I think there certainly is this sort of shift to understanding how the informal economy, the township economy, the rural areas economies fit into value chains and become part of an ecosystem that is much more inclusive. So I think, I think we're seeing a much more sort of dynamic and agile and sort of positive type of development. It's certainly not widespread. I certainly think there are sticky areas that need to be unblocked, but it's not all doom and gloom. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Let me go to Ivan Ishrostam, and then Prof. Hall, if you want to. I see you've posted another comment on food insecurity, so you might want to elaborate on that. But Ivan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'm very grateful for this particular forum and the opportunity to address the delegates. I'm from a fledgling organization called Gold Future South Africa, and our point of departure is that there's been a very, very deep-seated, fundamental and systemic problem that has been totally ignored. Many of the problems that we have in terms of our lack of growth have been talked about, although there haven't been very good solutions. But one problem hasn't been looked at all, and that is the economic war between the proponents of socialism and capitalism in this country, or between labor and business. No local or overseas businesses are going to invest in this country to any serious degree while this economic war continues. This war has existed for decades. It's time that business, labor got together and worked through their baggage of the past and became partners in this economy. While we are fighting each other, we are going to get nowhere. None of the measures that we've been talking about are going to gain traction when we're in a situation where we have two competing ideologies. So the solution is for business and labor to replace these competing ideologies with a common ideology, which for the moment I will call Sharerism, whereby workers and business owners at the ground level partner together to make the profits for the business and to share those profits equally. I want to stress, to share those profits fairly between workers and business. When we start a movement in that direction, then we will see very quick and very great investment in this country and economic growth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. Prof Hall, let me go to you, please. Oh, you're muted, Prof. No, we can't hear you.
Is your computer mute maybe on?
Oh, goodness. Okay.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Hear you now.
Thanks so much. So just wanted to not really comment on East Asia and so on, but clearly there's a structural problem of de-agrarianization in the absence of the industrialization. And in that context, I was commenting on food and agro-food systems. And just what's so striking is the interventions on the consumption side around dealing with hunger, and on the production side, often support for small scale and subsistence farmers is sort of a go-to because it's recognized as, many people, relatively modest amounts of money. And clearly the PESI intervention was very important there and much more widespread and more effective than the initial support from agriculture, land reform and rural development, which was cumbersome, too late, etc. But I think that, what's so striking is that in this thinking about recovery, there's a focus on either the consumption side and shoring up buying power through very modest social grants, and on the other hand, production side with no intervention in the structure of the food system itself. And so, our research, which I've just shared here, is showing how both small-scale farmers, small-scale fishers have been locked out of markets through COVID, and there hasn't been a simple recovery. And the market space has been lost. And at the same time, there's been this huge gap between food price inflation far shooting beyond CPI, and the transition there where food prices overtake general CPI is March 2020, and that gap is getting bigger and it's not closing. There is no recovery in that. And meanwhile, we have very significant profits and dividends being declared by supermarkets, ShopRite, Tiger Brands. So I think that a key issue in thinking about recovery is about valuing and about recognizing the employment intensive small-scale farming, including peri-urban agriculture, but linked with a right to trade in the city, because promoting the production without any other wider food system change has been very unproductive. As many people were telling us, don't give us more inputs without resolving this problem. So yeah, I just wanted to say the productionist emphasis in terms of agriculture and the food system in isolation has been misplaced and needs to go along with rethinking the right to trade in the city, space for trading, and the support for the informal sector. And so equitable access to land can't just be a rural production issue. It has to be urban, it has to be production and trade. And that's what my feeling has been missing, but that's sort of by the by. Thanks very much for an interesting discussion.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Thank you. I can see if there's a couple more hands, we'll come back to another round of questions just now. Sheila, I can see your hand, Herman, but let me go back to the panel. Rudy, perhaps I can start with you. Maybe if you could just sort of give a 3 to 5 minute response, perhaps max, just so we can get around everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if it's 3 to 5 minutes, but I don't also want to stifle debate because I quite enjoy the conversations that are happening. I think that sometimes some of us live in bubbles and we forget about the real world out there and the kind of interaction that some of us in government or those in business have been engaging upon. For example, some of the work that Tanya refers to, and we can see the kind of impacts that the work that we are doing on particular sectors as we try and deal with either structural reforms, interventions around investment, dealing with specific issues to unblock, and slowly, of course, getting confidence and that alignment that Fuad talks about. Because that's primarily the important thing, that we need to work on that misalignment. And I think there's a lot of effort and interventions out there, certainly to be able to ensure that that alignment takes place. Of course, confidence is not simply going to be a measure that happens overnight. Confidence happens when there's consistency in policy, there's policy certainty, policy pronouncements on particular issues that we're silent on, and that, of course, there is partnerships going on between government, business, and labor. And this is the reflection of the administration. The administration wants to develop a stronger partnership with different sectors of society in doing that. And certainly from our perspective, I think that's happened. The master plans is one process. There are other conversations. More recently, we had a conversation with entrepreneurs and innovators around what is it that we can unblock to create a better entrepreneurial society in South Africa and reducing red tape. The other day, we had conversations with a number of other people around employment and employment interventions. So I think the point for me about providing always a binary option, it's either this or that, is problematic. It's highly problematic in the kind of recovery that we're looking at. So I disagree vehemently that there's no plan. Of course, there's a plan in place, right? And there are particular interventions that are happening. Whether some of it is successful or not, I think that's quite certain. But certainly for me, there's a plan that is in place. There are interventions happening. Some of the plans, of course, as we implement, and of course, as we assess its effectiveness and its efficacy, we have to change direction. But that's the flexibility and innovation of what we need to do. Part of this plan is quite clearly developing a partnership. Now, why I say the bubble, because it's interesting that Tanya, not myself, and anyone from government over here, it's Tanya who represents the private sector through the Public-Private Growth Initiative. It's Labour who represents unions, for example, that is able to reflect on the strong partnership and the slow change in the way that investors and business see us. And I think that's important. That's a reflection of the kind of work that I think is starting. It doesn't necessarily say that you can roll out the red carpet, government is doing what it is. And, we should be the first to admit and to fall on our soul and to say these things are not happening. But certainly from a point of view, and I want to respond to Michael's comments, because I think some of it is very disingenuous, right? And I need to be frank about it. Because at the end of the day, if you're saying that we are going to do through fiscal consolidation a number of interventions when we are in a crisis, as it is, 11 million plus people are unemployed. We saw an impact as a result of the stopping of the SRD grant, for example. Now, you may blame it on a number of other political dynamics that are there, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it was because of people being poor. And if you see the videos, if you see some of the interventions and comments, it is because of that, right? So we were able to do a number of interventions to be able to ensure that we prevent the kind of crisis of not meeting food needs, of not meeting basic needs, households and firms, of course. And that intervention has happened. There's a combination of different things, from the SRD grant to the extension. Ruth and them have been working on some of the work around, agrarian and agrarian reforms, and some of the interesting work that we hope to take up. But let me just say why I think, Michael, why I think you're disingenuous in saying that public employment programs or the PAS is going to displace employment in certain private sector jobs. Public employment programs have always been around. What we've done is scale it and innovate. what we've done, if one talks about the budget allocation of about 10 billion rand, how is that going to displace some of the significant amount of budget allocations that are supposed to go into education or health? Does it mean then, if we talk about an ETI and the success of an ETI, and we wish to scale up the ETI and target different sectors of the economy, and of course we increase the ETI by additional 10 billion rand, does it mean that it's also going to displace employment in certain parts of the private sector? I think that is not the case. Public employment programs have always been around. And for us to be able to say that if we're paying public employment and it's cheap, undermines labor law, it's short term, of course, this is part of the intervention that we have. As the economy recovers, as employment recovers, public employment becomes a much more important feature and intervention for us to be able to do that. So we don't see the presidential employment stimulus running on for infinitum. It cannot be the case, but we certainly have to see it as part of an intervention to support young people. So it's not about displacing existing employment. If you go and talk and see some of the studies, perhaps you need to see some of the studies and the evaluations that we're having in the school sector. So very importantly, 320,000 young people employed at minimum wages, and the impact that it has, and some of the work that Mary has done, some of the work that Sipert Rasana has done on the NECT, and the impact that has had in supporting teachers in the school and being able to deliver on better outcomes. Now, we haven't seen better outcomes yet, but certainly from the kind of studies that we've seen, both from the NECT and from Mary Metcalf, shows the importance of that school program through a public employment intervention supporting that, not displacing teachers. And anyway, in actual fact, part of the program was to try and ensure that some teachers that were in temporary posts were becoming permanent. In actual fact, what it did do, Michael, was that 5,000 vacancies in the basic education space was actually filled and using many of those young people that were teacher assistants or general assistants at the school program. I think it's just, I certainly don't think that's the case that we want to displace. I think that it's important that we cannot go for a fiscal consolidation. It's a debate that we're having in government. There are serious crises. We need to find solutions about dealing with some of these issues. So I thought it's important that I park that and just say that. I think there are many other comments. I think I agree with many of the other colleagues when one talks about policy contestation and uncertainty. It doesn't help us, and I think we're trying to address that. Again, government adopted. So there's a comment that is made around uncertainty around climate change and a just transition. Now, as far as I know, Cabinet has endorsed two particular positions. Firstly, it's endorsed the just transition framework, where it sees, of course, decarbonization, accelerated decarbonization, and a net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, that also means that we have to look at the IRP. One has to look at how one invests in the renewable energy sector. That's the first policy intervention that I think is important. Secondly, the second and the most important policy intervention that I've done is to commit to an NDC, a national determined contribution range of 420 to 350 megatons CO2 equivalent. Now, I think those are the two most important policy interventions, unequivocally so, expressing government's view around climate change and a just transition. By putting in that range means that if we are committing to a net zero emissions by 2050, then we're going to have to haul ass, and we're going to have to make certain particular interventions where we shift from a coal-dependent economy to a decarbonized, renewable energy intervention economy. And I think that's quite important for us, that we do get that certainty. And I think that's the first step that we've done, that we invest again in our manufacturing sector that had a stop-start in the renewables energy space, and of course, some of the other stuff. I do think that there's some comments on the reform. I think it was Herman that made a comment on the reform process, and that we shouldn't, blow our horns too quick or stand on our high horse around the reforms. I agree with you. I think it's important that when you talk about the 100 megawatt cap, it's the first phase of ensuring that we get private sector participation in the generation space other than the reprogram. So this is quite critical. The success of it is, of course, when many energy intensive industrial users or mines move off and they do the generation capacity for their own use or for passing it on to other users, for example. I think that's the success of the program that should be measured, not the announcement and the changes. The same with the ports. It's the first step. And I think these steps are important to be able to get some alignment with the private sector, to get some investment from the private sector in both energy, port, and the rail space. And I think it's the first step going forward. I thought that's a couple of comments, and I don't want to limit the debate, but I think it's important for me to respond to a few things that have been said here. Thanks.
That's great. So no, thanks really for picking up on some of the comments in the chat that were directed to you. I appreciate that. Let me go to Lebogang and give you an opportunity to respond. There was also, I see, a direct question in the chat to you around Kasatu's position on the NDP, sorry, and therefore the ERRP. But let me give you an opportunity to respond generally to the comments and questions.
Thank you very much. And thanks for a very lively discussion. I don't think the nature of this debate is around elevating one intervention that's going to be, you know, the silver bullet that's going to take us to an economic recovery. I think that's why the ERRP is good in the sense that it proposes a number of interventions that require focus, and as a collective, they're assisting us in with regards to the process of recovery. Maybe just to deal with just to respond to the first question by Professor Hall. I absolutely agree that there's definitely need to focus to that. And this is because, you know, you can't have an agrarian sector or economy without a manufacturing, and manufacturing without agrarian sector. So the two actually have reciprocal benefits, and there's both backward and forward linkages. So the two of them are very much independent, and the positive spillovers of the agrarian economy have a positive factor on one to the exclusion of the other. The two have a mutual benefit in terms of their reciprocal benefit. I don't think that there was an emphasis on just one to the total exclusion of the other. Listen, I do agree that there is a difference between, you know, the various experiences of South Africa with the rest of the world. But the truth is that, you know, if we're going to adopt a policy or a trajectory of rapid economic growth, there are structural changes that the economy must sort of grapple with. And to some extent, since the 1980s, that structural transformation has been taking place. And we also need to address the fact that we haven't really benefited from improvements to manufacturing and the manufacturing sector, which is important, especially if we're going to be looking absolutely correct that issues of agrarian reform definitely need to be addressed, but the two work together. I don't think there was some sort of indication that we're advocating for one over the other. The two definitely do work hand in hand. The question around our position on the ERRP, I was not critical. I was not critical of the ERRP. In fact, what I did say in the beginning was that it was very important, especially the short-term interventions were very important to kickstart the economy following the hard lockdown. And what I did take time even to explain is that, you know,
Lebogang, we're losing you intermittently. Can you hear us? Okay, let's maybe go back to Lebogang in a moment when her sound issues are resolved. Yeah, sorry to interrupt that, but Nduduzi, perhaps we can go to you and come back to Lebogang. Can I hand over to you to respond to some of the comments?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Much appreciated. The discussion is quite helpful, because sometimes you might think that what you have as your ideas, if engaged with others, it will enhance the interventions that we're making in the economy as we're rebuilding back and indeed building better. I think the GCRO survey with regards to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is very important, because It even touches on the issues of food security in as far as the intervention that the government made with regards to social relief. And that those numbers must be taken very, very seriously, because it means just during COVID-19, we had so many, I think about 2 million or more people that were assisting with regards to social relief as an intervention by government. And I think just based on that, the critical question is that if you are saying you are rebuilding, you are bringing back interventions into the economy, you have to work on those numbers, and those are real people, those are real households. So I think that's the usefulness of the work that we're doing with the GCRO. And that's why the what we consider to be our interventions, whether it's about mass employment, part of it is to put in place short-term interventions, short-term, medium, and to long-term interventions, so that as many people as possible participate in the economy. I'd also like to indicate that the reason why we're investing, as Dr. Mazwai is saying, on the township or rather the township economies is primarily because the majority of people find themselves in those spaces, and it is in those spaces that the majority of them do not have access to some of the critical socioeconomic interventions. And that's why together, as Tanya was saying, we want to redirect certain investments in those spaces so that we can be able to create opportunities. And I think it's also part and parcel of our spatial transformation agenda, because part of it includes long-term investment in as far as you can see in the city of Joburg, we're talking the BRTs, we're talking transport, we're talking road network, because without sufficient and efficient road network and the movement of people, in particular also the movement of goods, you are unlikely to unlock issues or perhaps to unlock the economy. So one of the things we're doing, if you just again use the Tshwane Special Economic Zone right in the heart of Mamelodi, a lot of SMMEs through certain packages that we've arranged as part of our township economic revitalization, we've created opportunities for SMMEs in those parts of the city region, so that the investment is directly felt by people in those particular communities. And that's why you would find in this investment, there's a sense of stability. Even during COVID-19, this work has happened because of the collaboration and the manner in which we're creating this partnership. So we're even using our own model of the TSEPO 1 million, because the TSEPO 1 million is a direct intervention that looks at young people that are out of school, young people that are in drugs, young people that are finding themselves in conflict with the law, that necessarily would not have opportunity. So through the TSEPO 1 million, including the work now we're doing with the presidential stimulus package in terms of youth in particular, we're making the necessary interventions where it really matters most. Again, with the Township Economy Bill, one of the critical interventions we're making there, Tamlin, is that at the end of the day, you need to create what we call a one provincial bylaw that protects the informal sector or informal traders, but create an enabling environment for them to be able to trade in a manner that they can still be able to do some of the things that I think Prof. Ruth Hall is raising. That if we're saying through the agricultural strategy, our agro-processing strategy, as we're investing in the commercialization of small farmers, we don't just say we're going to give them money, but we also create a value chain wherein they can participate in market. So those are some of the package interventions that we're making in order to be as practical as possible, so that we can make the necessary interventions in the economy. I must also indicate that all things said and done, the problems of our economy are not just about solving the South African problem. We need to think about the whole of the SADC region because of the interconnectedness of the Gauteng and the South African economy with the rest of the SADC region. So we've got to be alive to the fact that as many people as possible come into the South African economy, in particular the Gauteng space, and therefore we need to be able to work together and solve those problems that they bring, and many of them relate to health. Many of them relate to education, because people come into this space for those kind of interventions. But if we're not efficient enough in delivering on some of those issues, we might not make the necessary interventions in the economy. So for us, really, all said and done, social compacting is important. Some of the critical policy reforms that we think, working with national, we can advance. And we will continue to put that on the table of the national government so that we can be able to make sure that the necessary interventions are made in creating stability, but also creating a sense that suggests that meaningfully we are responding to the problems that the people of South Africa, or in particular of Gauteng, are faced with. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lebo, can you hear us? Would you like to, sorry, we lost your sound before, so I moved on to Mdu, but you're welcome to come back in now.
Yes, and I'm just going to make a quick point before I get cut off again. And I just wanted to agree with the points of Ivan. I think, what he raises is a significant proposal, and I think we should actually think about it more seriously. Social compacting is happening at a national level between business and labor, and government and community organizations. But the truth is, at the workplace level, we're not getting that type of collaborative thinking and cooperation. The bargaining councils were supposed to assist employees and employers to be able to achieve this, but not so many people are party to collective bargaining councils. I think this is probably key, and if there could be as many business owners who jump onto this bandwagon, I think a number of employees would really take up this opportunity. A significant driver of inequality is wages and wage inequality. So if we were to correct for that and to engage into this process of equal sharing based on your efforts and your inputs, I think this would definitely be a great way forward. I think cooperation is definitely the way to go.
Thanks so much, Lebo. Thank you. Okay, Michael, can I hand over to you now? Michael Sachs.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. So I agree entirely that there's a large architecture of social compacting, and that there are productive meetings and good discussions taking place between business and labor and the like. And I also agree that government is running really good projects in a lot of areas. So we've heard from Mdu about SEPO 1 million and Rudy about the presidential employment stimulus. So I can see that there are good meetings taking place in these, I don't want to call them bubbles but anyway, there are good meetings taking place amongst people at that apex. And there are good projects being run by government. What I'm asking is, when I add these things together, do they give me confidence that in the next few years, government is going to substantially change the path of growth and development? And I think I'm saying they do not. That's my first point. And my second point is that when I say government doesn't have a plan, what I'm saying is that that there are fundamental contradictions at the heart of its policy stance. And these aren't minor things. They are very major. So I suppose since the MTBPS is coming in the next couple of weeks, this week, Cabinet would have agreed on the fiscal framework. And I don't know whether the fiscal framework has changed, but government's program, which government announced in its budget in February, implies a very large negative fiscal impulse for the next 3 to 5 years. It implies the reduced provision of public health care, basic education and policing. It implies lower public employment. And it implies that the incomes of teachers and nurses and police officers will fall in real terms for the next 3 to 5 years. That is government's program, it's not mine. On the other hand, government is saying, look, we have a project which is employing teaching assistants in schools. But it's immediately apparent that government is not committed to its own fiscal program when they say that. Because yes, entirely, the 11 billion that's been extracted out of the budget by the president for his program is money coming out of other fiscal space, is a reduction in the fiscal space for core public services. This year, government gave public servants an above inflation wage increase of about 6%. And the number of employees on government's payroll has substantially increased because the community health workers in Gauteng, for instance, have been taken on to the government's payroll as permanent employees. So what I'm saying is not, I don't know whether it's the product of the bubble I'm living in or something, but when I look at government's own statements and its own programs, there are fundamental contradictions which contribute to my belief that as well, they will not be able to fundamentally change the path of growth and development in the next few years. And I'm not happy about this. This is a big problem. But I'm certainly not going to stop calling it how I see it, because, you know, I used to call it how I see it within government. Now I'm doing so from outside government. And so I hope if you take me as disingenuous, you should rather ask whether what I'm saying has some truth in it or not, the substance of what I'm saying. Because to me, the problem is not in the president's personal office. That's not where the issue is. They're doing a good job there. It's that there is no political consensus around these issues, around how to deal with the public utility sector in water, in roads, in electricity, and in logistics. There does not appear to be policy direction around these things. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to have a public investment program because those are the agencies that public investment those are the guys that execute public investment. So we can have policy statements and projects but what we should avoid is diverting attention from the central issues at a macroeconomic level that are constraining growth and development. And they've got everything to do with these fiscal questions of how you allocate costs across this society.
Thanks very much, Michael. There's a lot of issues coming up here around partnership and compacting, the need for consensus and for constructive conversations on these very issues. Let me go to Sheila Sisulu. I see you have posted a couple of questions in the chat around skills and capabilities of personnel in the public sector, but also around the issue of climate change. Do you want to elaborate on those or bring in another issue?
Yes, I'd like to thank you very much for letting me speak. I wanted to, I highlighted 3 issues, but I will speak to 2 issues because they are interrelated. That's the issue of the climate crisis, and food insecurity, food sovereignty. On the climate crisis, as an ordinary citizen, I cannot tell you right now how government is preparing for this definite crisis we are facing. I don't know where the center is in terms of a response or a preparedness. I'm not aware that there's an early warning system and preparedness, because I think if we did have one, COVID, we would have handled COVID slightly differently, because an early warning system and preparedness system is an early warning system not only of climate change, but of any crisis that might befall communities, or in this case, not only South Africa, but the globe. So we were running up and down with COVID, and it showed very many things, among them the issue of food insecurity and hunger, but also in the short-term responses to the hunger. It also showed the poor quality of infrastructure in where the majority of people live, both in the townships and in informal sectors. Some good meaning people, had to set up feeding or distribution centers outside of the townships or the informal settlements. So, and I just want to move now to the issue of climate crisis. One, I'm not sure where this is being discussed, what is being discussed, and what the plan is to deal with the impact that we know will come out of the climate crisis, particularly for poor people, particularly for people who live in delicate ecosystems. That I want to relate to the issue of food security. I think someone correctly said our framing of the issue of food security is very limited, if not outright wrong, because we look at production and we look at what is, we look at the national food security, but we don't look at household food security, because at household level, people need to be able to afford the food that is available and access it. And during COVID, again, I'll go back there, we saw that access, affordability were not there because we concentrate in South Africa on production, and that production is in agriculture. The question I was raising in the chat, well, where is the center where all these issues that are so interrelated are being discussed? So when we have, as we will, a huge climate crisis, it's not the environmental department only that must deal with that. It's not going to be the agriculture department only to deal with that. It's not going, it can't be social development only to deal with that. It's, I don't know where you go when you anticipate a problem like flooding. Which button do you press to get emergency assistance? Because we don't have those. But just in summary, I would like to say that government doesn't seem to have a centralized, coordinated early warning and preparedness system for emergencies of whatever nature. And when the emergency strikes, as did COVID, it puts us back a number of years and then we want to rebuild. So it's almost like we're moving forward and then a crisis hits that we know is coming, and then we are 5 years behind and now we've got to rebuild. So in working on economic recovery, I think we have to also work on prevention of devastation of whatever nature. I'm not saying we can stop it altogether, but I think we can limit the damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you for those inputs. Herman, let me go to you, please. Herman?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much, Heidi. One of the things that disappoints me attending webinars like this one is that we, in my opinion, ignore the big elephant in the room, namely the lack of trust many South Africans have in government and the large number of citizens of this country who are living in a state of hopelessness. And the latest episode with ESCOM is just increasing. Will it ever work? We have millions of people who live in an absolutely hopeless state. And we have 70% of unemployed young people, which is a potential powder keg that could explode any day. So we're talking about 5-year plans. We need immediate drastic action. One of the, and that you don't think are only kind of criticizing or pointing out what we are lacking. And one thing before I get to a possible solution is the other thing, which is the very low level or bad level of education of young people. We are releasing youngsters into the world unable to find work, not necessarily because there is no work, but very often because they are just intellectually not fit to work because of a bad educational system. One of the things, there are many NGOs out there who do excellent work, and this applies particularly to the agricultural sector. And small fundings by government of those NGOs could have immediate and fairly big impacts. I don't want to waste more of the time. Things have been going on for quite a while, but this is a kind of observation from my side. And I think if we don't wake up, unfortunately, what Michael Sachs has been indicating is going to be low level of problems than what's going to happen in real life in this country. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Herman. I'm going to go back to the responses from the panel. Let me ask Lebogang to come in first, because I know she's on the last few, the last bit of her battery due to load shedding. So Lebo, you can come in first. And let me just add to Sheila and Herman's comments, a couple from the chat that have come up around creating an inclusive economy by considering and factoring in the informal economy, and how are we going to do that, and what role government and municipalities can play in facilitating an enabling environment for the informal economy. And then secondly, a question from Monica Newton on public infrastructure spending, and that seems to be less of a priority in current plans than in the past. So maybe we could have a bit of a response on that. But Lebo, let me go to you first.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and my apologies. Yeah, the electricity was meant to be back by now. You know, we can't talk about inclusive society if we don't factor in the informal economy. We're starting to exhibit the phenomena of the rest of Africa, where as workers or as formal employment starts to shrink, workers then transition into the informal economy. So definitely there needs to be significant look into the economy and make it in such a way that, I know that the official term within the ILO is to formalize the informal sector, but I think we need to go above and beyond that. Let's create some sort of backward and forward linkages between the formal and the informal sector. Let's provide decent protection of labor rights and labor standards for persons who operate in the informal economy. And I think that these are ways in which we then start to broaden our focus and creating this inclusive economy and inclusive society for informal sector workers. I mean, when you look at the way in which capital and other technological flows, they don't flow in the direction of the informal economy. So definitely, if we're going to take seriously these notions around an inclusive economy and inclusive society, much more work, maybe more than what we've been doing, much more work needs to go into how we factor in the participation and the inclusivity of the informal sector. I mean, there's been a number of points that have been rightly raised in this platform, and these go into a large portion of a number of issues, quick fixes that can easily be addressed. I mean, if I think about the comments around the township economy and how we've really neglected it and haven't paid enough attention to it as much as what we should, and these are the things that are going to unlock this whole notion of an inclusive economy. I think the issues of public infrastructure, Rudy, I think you're more qualified to address them than me.
Thanks very much, Lebogang. Thank you. Rashid, can I go to you briefly from the GCRO before we go to the rest of the panel? Rashid?
Sorry,
okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone as well. But perhaps I would just like to say some concluding remarks. So maybe I should do it at the end, if that's okay.
Of course, that's absolutely fine, no problem. Let's go back to the panel then. Rudy, can I hand over to you for some final thoughts?
I think there's another hand from Seshupo.
Oh, sorry. You're right, there is, sorry. Seshupo, let me take your comment or question and then we'll wrap up with the panel.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Chair. In the beginning, I posed a question regarding a developmental state. And it was a deliberate question because as a country, we can't go anywhere with the kind of state that we're having, a state where, municipalities are non-functional. Not so long ago, we had that Clover left Lichtenberg and because there were no services. So we can talk as much as we want to talk about recovery, reconstruction, but the current state, the South African state under the ANC, it will make that reconstruction and recovery plan difficult. I mean, even the type of people that we are going to elect now, or on the side of the ANC, it's mediocre people. I will make an example. I come from the Free State. Around Machabeng. The current mayor there is Spielman, the person called Spielman. We know his shenanigans, but yet he's still in the list currently of the ANC, and he's going to be elected and definitely might become a mayor again. So we can't talk about recovery, we can't talk about reconstruction with the current state that we find ourselves in. Hence, it is very important that we talk about a developmental state where we are talking about meritocracy. We are talking about strong institution that will able to implement policies. I mean, we are talking about township economy, formalizing the informal economy. With who in the municipalities? With who is going to lead that in the municipalities? I thank you.
Seshupo, thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, Rudy, let me go back over to you and you can respond to Seshupo as well as the other issues.
I know I'm not going to respond to Seshupo. Seshupo has made quite a bit of comments, and I think it's useful to perhaps look at it. I think his point is right that we need to have if we're looking at a developmental state, it has to be a functional developmental state. And I think the point that he makes, and I saw some of the comments early on, is if we have a dysfunctional municipal state or municipal systems where basic services like, potholes, traffic lights being fixed, water spillages constantly, sewage systems that are dysfunctional and not working, is quite critical. And I think this is the point that I want to make, that I think there's one thing that one has to admit, being in government, is that I think there is a challenge around capacity, particularly at that level, right? I think there are capacity constraints at a number of other departments also and provinces, but I think where the rubber hits the road and where we need to see the basic delivery of services and ensure functioning services, that are most basic: energy, water, sewage works working, right? Roads being tarred and maintained. This of course has had a significant impact on households and businesses, and Seshupo talks about that. there are many others. For example, if one just refers to, I just got a call where there were colleagues from the chemical sector who says the disruption in electricity has a significant impact on their ability to hold off on certain key components that have to go into chemicals. Similar for food and food production, for example, that constantly requires temperatures to be maintained at a certain level. And of course, when disconnection happens, this is the kind of stuff that it does have. Or simply just, water shortages and water cuts that are consistent. And these are important things that I think as a state we have failed dismally. I think that what we need to do, and as part of the kind of local government interventions, is a greater focus on trying to ensure there's a ability between different levels of the state to be able to ensure that does function. There are some ideas that have been thrown around, for example, around whether we have a specialized tasking to deal with water and sanitation, for instance, because this is quite critical, and that would be an area to deal with. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's significant failures on capacity and the ability to deliver on key areas that are there. I also think that, I want to just emphasize that I think what we do have to work on is policy certainty and that alignment. Because I like Fuad's point. Fuad's point is, what we need to do is work on that misalignment. And I think there's a general distrust either between government of the private sector and the private sector of government. Now, you can't operate in a society as ours where there's distrust between two sectors of the economy that requires for us to function in a mixed economy. This is what we have, We don't have a command central economy. We have, as Asupa talks about, an attempt of a developmental state. And I would want to still believe that it's a developmental state and that the interventions that we are making is to try and deal with some of the massive challenges as a result of apartheid and, of course, some of the socioeconomic impacts that have happened over the past years also, the global crisis, the COVID pandemic, the social unrest and the attempted insurrection in July. And these are challenges that I think are important for us to be able to work and confront collectively. And so I think I have a high degree of faith and a bit of opportunism still, optimism still, that working in that kind of collective partnerships are important to be able to get that confidence going that Fuad talks about, because that's the most important thing. Once you have confidence, once people understand that they understand the role of the state, they understand the particular roles that they're going to play, and the interventions and the decisions that they make are quite clear and are communicated quite clearly, I think that helps a lot. And so I think, yes, quite a bit of work still needs to be done, but that needs to be done quite clearly. Mike, just one more thing I thought that is important. And I just wanted to say this in closing, that I think the public, the consolidation of the wage bill, happened before the COVID interventions and the ERR. And I think that's important. So government took a decision way back in 2018, 2019, towards the end of 2019, where there was a clear announcement that, what we're going to do is take a decision on the consolidation of the wage bill and, of course, not make any particular offers. I think that drawing a correlation between funding for public employment and the decision that was taken earlier on the consolidation of the wage bill and not necessarily giving any more increases, I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. And I don't think there is necessarily a correlation, because, of course, any funding pressure, as you well know in the budget office, any funding pressure could dispel that. I'm simply saying the scale of the public employment program is so small and minuscule that it cannot have an impact on that. And neither is it trying to undermine permanent jobs, middle-class sector, services, and employment in that particular sector. I think that's an important point for me. So going forward, I think this has been a robust and a very useful conversation. A long road still to travel, but I think there's some interesting progress that has been made. I think that there's not been a lot of conversations around some of the Operation Vulindlela and the structural reforms. I think those are the kind of confidence boosting measures, and you could see the tick up in confidence in one loses any one of the index when we announced, for example, on the 100 megawatts and subsequent announcements on the separation of TNPA from Transnet. We're hoping that that kind of confidence continues to permeate through, through private sector and of course elsewhere, if we deal with some of the obstacles that's currently besetting us around spectrum auctioning. I know, of course, that ICASA has put out an information memorandum as part of the build-up towards actually having the spectrum auction. We know, of course, the ministry has been, the Department of Communications, Digital and Communications, as a plan in place on the digital broadcasting migration process, so that in March, as ICASA has set out, that an actual auction has taken place, so that you're able to efficiently allocate the spectrum for better uses, reducing costs and accessibility. So many of these
we've lost sound. We've lost your sound.
What I'm saying, many of these reforms are going to be quite important for us to develop that confidence and get that alignment with the private sector. So I'm hoping that a bit more comments and conversations around that beyond this forum is something that we should engage on going forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rudy. Mduduzi, let me go to you for your final inputs.
No, thank you very much. And we've definitely taken away a lot, Heidi, from the conversation of what people have raised. I do want to admit that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic did demonstrate a sense that we're not as organized with regards to responding to issues in the manner in which Meshila Sisulu has raised. But we do believe that with now a better understanding of the Disaster Management Act, we are beginning to, having concluded a few case studies and just understanding our contribution as not only the province, but as a country, we are beginning to think about what can we do better to invest in disaster management capacity, which that on its own requires, to a very great extent, investment in certain capacities. And those capacities that one refers to will include understanding the impact of global trends, which we believe that before the COVID-19 situation, we had looked at the various global trends, their impact into our economy, but we never looked at the impact on the pandemic. So we're investing in that, working with National Capita as an important intervention going forward, including issues of climate change, because I think that's the point that we are making, that government must demonstrate as much as possible as to whether we're ready for what is envisaged as the impact of climate change into our economy, just as we should have done with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it is important to also say that from where we're sitting, working with national government with regards to rebuilding better, rebuilding economies, the plan that we've put across of growing Gauteng together, to a very great extent, we are seeing results, but we think more work has got to be done. And more importantly, we want to make the point that relying on evidence, Heidi, research, data will assist us a lot. And what data is telling us now is that there are a lot of challenges from what many presenters have made, from Lebogang to Michael. And so we're taking that very seriously. And I think if it means to remodel, really looking at what we're doing, we'll do that, because we need to do things better in order to address the current problems of unemployment, poverty, and inequality in our province. We're going to consolidate on where we are doing well, working with the private sector and working with national government in order to attain a much better, if you like, educational attainments in terms of the necessary skills that the economy requires. And working with universities will be very, very important, so that we can be able to produce the kind of skills that the economy needs in order for us to become a globally competitive. Thank you very much for the opportunity. We're looking forward to further engagements on how we can do better to rebuild the economy of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mduduzi. Thanks so much for those final comments. Michael, let me finish with you.
Thanks. I think the reform agenda that is being pursued and that Rudy speaks to is fundamentally important. The issues of spectrum and the issues of the 100 megawatts and all of those things are fundamentally important and really critical that people within government are pushing those things. But my concern is that, I suppose if I put it like this, that, this is a long list that hasn't changed much in a decade. And it's so when you talk about spectrum, it was supposed to happen in 2010 or something like that. And it's just, I suppose, infuriating. And it creates a sense that while we must keep pushing for these reforms, it's like they're almost like small victories in an overwhelming sense of unresolved problems. And so the Seshupo raises now the problem of the fiscal crisis of local government, which is also in fiscal crisis in my view. And it relates, Merle Lipton in the chat was talking about rising taxes. But I think for me, the underlying issue is that we are unwilling to, we want to sustain high cost structures in the public sector, whether that's at local government, in state-owned companies, in the network industries. We retain high cost structures. And when you have high cost structures, it means your electricity is going to be more expensive and your local services are going to be more expensive and your universities are going to be more expensive. But while we are keen to maintain these high cost structures, we're not keen to impose the costs of those structures on society in the form of rates and user charges at local government, which has not been collecting them, in the form of tariffs on electricity that reflect the true cost of production, in respect of port charges that I see now we're discussing this morning. So definitely taxes are going up. And unfortunately, because in all of these other areas, we are so reluctant to impose user charges on people, it leaves everyone drawing from the same pot, and that pot is general taxation. And Merle suggests that we need to look at kind of wealth taxes and that kind of thing. But I think what's important to state is, so taxes are going to have to go up because even if we don't do anything more developmental, simply because of the debt, because the rising debt and the rising debt service costs leaves you with two options, essentially. One is to force down the provision of social services in a very fundamental way, sustained over a long period of time, which is what is on the table. And the second is to raise taxes to pay the interest on the debt, which is not currently on the table, but very much should be on the table, because the key difference between the two is obviously distributional. It's not about economic growth. Like taxes are bad for economic growth, but so are spending reductions. And the spending reductions are bad in a double sense because they reduce the aggregate demand in the economy, but they also begin to undermine healthcare and basic education and criminal justice, which are fundamental to the kind of potential output growth in the economy. And so we need to recognize that in order to get what we want, which is development, we have to make sacrifices that create an environment of growth. And we can no longer afford to hold on to our, well, look, the problem is that I'm not sure whether our political configuration, as Seshupo also was pointing to, has what it takes to go down that kind of path. And so I hope hardworking and dedicated public servants like Rudy keep trying to push, and we'll keep putting your toes on the fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much. Rashid, would you like to jump in here as one of the organizers and say a few words before we close?
Yeah. First, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for attending. Maybe I should just zoom out a little bit. I know that Heidi in her introduction did raise some of these issues, but I think it's really a matter of sort of kind of beginning to knit all of this stuff together. And just to remind everyone that the original rationale for this webinar series of 3 separate webinars was really sort of stimulated by the when we had a discussion between the GCRO and MISTRA soon after the July events, the uprisings in July. Some people call them an insurrection. You can call them what you want to. And we basically felt that, I mean, the crisis in South Africa needed some kind of public discourse and discussion. And we sort of broke them up into 3 discrete yet related areas of the social and community dimension, the economic dimension, and the governance dimension, with the understanding that each of these have their own discrete and kind of specific issues, but yet they are very closely interrelated. So we had a very successful first webinar in September, at the end of September, and there I think really we sort of looked at the issue around the fragmentation and dislocation, the issues around poverty, inequality, gender-based violence, racism, kind of things that exist at community level. And I think that it was clear that many of those issues related to the incapacities of the state, but also to the crisis in the economy. So in a way, that was one of the bridges from the first webinar into this one. And I think once we got here, I think we've had a fantastic set of panelists and a really amazing discussion. I think we hit about 120 people roughly, just to say that something like 400 people had registered, but this is obviously over a pretty long lead time, and we know there's a lot of attrition. But I think the kinds of people that we've had present, both listening in and contributing actively in the chat and so on, aside from the panelists, was really great. I'm not going to repeat what the panelists said, but I think they raised a whole range of issues, which I think, well, of course, Michael being Michael, would raise a provocation, and I worked with him in government as well for a year. And you know, he's really good at actually getting to the nub of the problem, as it were. So thank you for, and continue doing that wonderful work, Michael. I think that you that I think is really important for us to sort of sit back and look and have another look. But at the same time, I think that the colleagues from government, Rudy and Ndu, were basically talking about, I think, the efforts that are being made, and I think the kind of recovery that we came after the really disastrous previous administration. We all know what we're talking about. And I think that, I mean, that process has been slow. Some say too slow, but I think at least there's a fair amount of traction in relation to getting things together. But I think Mike's provocation still remains in terms of you know, the lack of a coherent program, and I think that issue needs to be taken forward, in as much as the issues being raised by, well, not only the government people, but also by Labour from COSATU in relation to saying, how do we actually continue with the kinds of efforts that we currently have? And one of the things then is about the agency of the state to actually kind of get things going and ensure coherence and so on. And that leads us now to the third seminar, or webinar that we have in the series, just to say that it's scheduled for Wednesday, the 24th of November. And I think that it's going to be quite exciting, because in a way we're beginning to pull together, I think, the issues that came up from the previous 2 webinars into this one, but obviously looking at some individual issues. We got a great lineup of people. We're going to look at Graham Goss from the GCRO. We'll be looking at what has come out of a quality of life survey with regard to attitudes to government. MISTRA has got Eba and Joel Neshitenje. we have somebody talking about trust, work that is being done by DPME. And hopefully, we're still waiting for confirmation. I think a very important, for the want of a better word, public representative or executive in the public sphere. And I think hopefully we get that person. I think it'll be really important to have that conversation. So I think that thanks again. I think it's a really excellent set of presentations and discussions. And really, I can, in my mind, I can see this sort of map coming together about the interconnections and interrelationships between these supposedly discrete elements. But I think coming together, and this is the final point I want to make, in a what we're calling a provocation. It's a particular research paper instrument of the GCRO that we'll write up jointly with MISTRA, which will pull all of the discussions together. And maybe just to say that the idea is, what are those things that are going to enable us to actually take the country forward? Of course, I mean, it's not the final word on the matter, there's no doubt about that, but certainly it is our modest contribution to that overall discussion and debate. And Heidi, thanks a lot. I'll leave it at that. And over to you. Oh, just let me thank Heidi, because nobody's going to do that. But Heidi, thanks a lot for, I think, excellent facilitation during the course of this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rashid, and thanks again to all the participants, the contributors and the presenters. And as Rashid said, please do join us again on the 24th of November for the third in the series on rebuilding government. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, Rudy, Michael, Nduduzi, Ebahang.
Thanks, Heidi. Thanks to the team.
Okay, colleagues, I'm going to kill the meeting.
Okay, kill it dead.
Thanks, Fukazi.
There we go. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Germany.
Thanks, Jürgen. Good to see you here. How is Berlin? Is Berlin cold?
It is 2 degrees during nighttime and up to 10 during daytime, but it's sunny.
Okay. Well, you'll be here soon, so you can enjoy the heat of South Africa.
Okay, thanks a lot for your help. Huh?
All the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye then. Bye. JP, how are you? Is JP Landman still in the room? No.
Okay, colleagues, thank you very much. The meeting is going to end now.
Okay, thanks, Norma. Take care.
Thanks, Alpha. Goodbye, everyone.